The greedy stepfather sells a young girl to a wealthy old man, expecting a fat payout, only to unravel a chain of events no one saw coming. Like, share, subscribe, comment for more inspiring tales. The air was thick with tension that humid summer evening as Lila stood trembling on the creaky porch of her rundown trailer. Her wide hazel eyes darted toward her stepfather, Carl, a wiry man with a permanent scowl etched into his sunburned face. His meaty hand gripped her arm tight enough to leave a mark, while his other hand waved a crumpled wad of cash like it was some kind of trophy. "This it, girl," he barked, his voice rough from years of cheap whiskey and cigarettes. "You're finally worth something to me." Across the dirt yard, a sleek black car idled, its engine purring like a predator waiting to strike. The back door swung open and out stepped Mr. Hargrove, an old man with a silver cane and a suit that screamed money. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto Lila, and her stomach twisted into knots. She was only 16, small for her age, with tangled brown hair and a quiet way about her that made people overlook her. But tonight she was the center of a deal she never asked for. A deal that was about to change everything. The trailer park was a forgotten speck on the edge of town, where rusted swing sets creaked in the wind and stray dogs sniffed through overturned trash cans. Lila had lived there her whole life, ever since her mom married Carl after her real dad took off. The place smelled like damp earth and motor oil, and on nights like this, with the cicadas screaming in the trees, it felt like the world was closing in. She could still hear her mom's voice in her head, soft and tired, telling her to be good before she got sick and left Lila alone with Carl. That was 3 years ago, and since then, he'd made it clear she was nothing but a burden. Now, here he was, practically dancing with glee as he shoved her toward Mr. Hargrove's car. "Go on, girl," he snapped, his breath sour with booze. "This man's going to take care of you better than I ever could." Lila's sneakers scuffed the dirt as she stumbled forward, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Mr. Hargrove loomed closer, his cane tapping the ground like a countdown. Out close, she could see the lines carved deep into his face, his thin lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was older than her grandpa had been, with a voice smooth as polished wood. "You'll do just fine, my dear," he said, reaching out a bony hand. She flinched, but Carl's grip tightened, forcing her to stay put. The trailer park faded into a blur behind her, the sagging roofs, the flickering porch lights, the life she'd known slipping away. What kind of man paid money for a girl like her? And why did Carl think this was his ticket out of the gutter? She remembered the whisper she'd overheard last week, Carl muttering into his phone about a big score, his laugh sharp and greedy. She hadn't thought much of it then, too busy scraping together meals from canned soup and stale bread. But now it hit her like a punch to the gut. He'd been planning this, waiting for the right moment to cash her in. The air grew heavier as Mr. Hargrove's driver, a hulking guy with a shaved head and a blank stare, stepped out and opened the car's back door wider. Lila's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like they were stuck in mud. The cicada's hum grew louder, drowning out Carl's cackling as he counted the bills. What was waiting for her in that car? And how had her life come down to this? One desperate, ugly trade in the middle of nowhere. The car door loomed like a black hole, ready to swallow Lila whole. And for a split second, time seemed to freeze. Her eyes flicked back to Carl, his greedy fingers still clutching the cash, his grin wide and rotten. Then to Mr. Hargrove, who tipped his head slightly, like he was inspecting livestock at an auction. She could feel the weight of their stares pinning her down. Something inside her snapped, like a string stretched too tight, finally breaking. "No!" she shouted, her voice cracking through the sticky night air. Carl's head jerked up, his eyes narrowing. "What'd you say, girl?" he barked, stepping closer, but Lila yanked her arm free, stumbling back. Her breath came fast and ragged, her hands trembling as she faced them both. "I'm not going anywhere with him." Mr. Hargrove's smile faltered, just for a heartbeat, and the driver shifted, his big frame tensing like he was ready to grab her. But then, the old man raised a hand, calm as you please, and the driver froze. Now, Hargrove said, his voice dripping with something dark and patient. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be, Lila." Her name in his mouth felt wrong, like a snake slithering over clean sheets. How did he even know it? Carl lunged forward, his face red and twisted. You ungrateful little, he started, but before he could finish, a sharp crack split the air. Everyone flinched, heads whipping toward the sound. Across the yard, old Mrs. Tanner, Lila's neighbor with the bad hip and the yappy little dog, stood on her sagging porch, a shotgun propped against her shoulder. The barrel smoked faintly, pointed at the sky from where she'd fired a warning shot. You let that girl go, Carl, she hollered, her voice shaky but fierce. I've had enough of your nonsense. The trailer park, usually dead quiet this time of night, seemed to wake up all at once. Porch lights flickered on, faces peeked through cracked blinds, and that little dog started barking its head off. Lila's heart leapt. Someone cared. Someone saw her. Carl cursed under his breath, his bravado crumbling as he glanced between Mrs. Tanner's gun and Hargrove's icy stare. Mr. Hargrove didn't move, didn't blink, just tapped his cane once against the dirt. This is unexpected, he murmured, his tone cool but edged with something dangerous. The driver took a step toward Mrs. Tanner, but Hargrove stopped him again with that same raised hand. Lila's mind raced. What was he planning? Was he going to back off, or was this about to get uglier? She could feel the tension coiling tighter like a storm about to break. Carl spat on the ground, clutching his money like it was his lifeline, but his eyes darted nervously now. Mrs. Tanner reloaded with a loud click, her hand steady despite her age. I said let her go, she yelled again. And right then, Lila realized this wasn't over, not by a long shot. What happened next? Nobody, not even her, could have guessed. The night held its breath as Mrs. Tanner stood her ground, the shotgun glinting under the dim glow of her porch light. Lila's chest heaved, her eyes wide and locked on the old woman who just turned everything upside down. Carl's face twisted with rage, but he didn't dare move, not with that barrel still hot and Mrs. Tanner's finger itching on the trigger. You crazy old bat, he shouted, his voice cracking like dry wood. This ain't your business. But Mrs. Tanner didn't flinch. It's my business. When I see a girl getting sold like a sack of potatoes, she fired back, her words sharp enough to cut through the humid air. The little dog at her feet yapped louder, darting around like it was ready to take on the world. Mr. Hargrove, though, stayed calm. Too calm. He leaned on his cane, watching the scene unfold like it was a play he'd seen before. This is a misunderstanding, he said smoothly, his voice sliding over the chaos like oil on water. I'm simply offering the girl a better life, education, opportunity. Lila's stomach churned. A better life? With him? She didn't buy it, not with the way his eyes gleamed like a hawk spotting prey. She took another step back, her sneakers crunching gravel, her mind screaming at her to run. But where the trailer park was a cage, and Carl had the keys, or at least he thought he did. Then a low rumble cut through the tension. A pickup truck rolling up the dirt road, its headlights slicing through the dark. It screeched to a stop, dust swirling, and out hopped Jake, Mrs. Tanner's grandson. He was tall, wiry, with a mop of dark hair and a temper that flared when he saw trouble. What the hell's going on? He yelled, his voice raw as he took in the scene. Lila trembling, Carl with his cash, Hargrove and his goons standing there like they owned the place. Mrs. Tanner lowered the gun just a bit, relief flashing in her eyes. Jake, thank God. They're trying to take Lila. Jake's gaze snapped to Carl, then Hargrove, and his fists clenched tight. You serious? He spat, storming forward. Carl backed up a step, clutching the money closer. Stay out of it, boy, he snarled, but Jake wasn't listening. He planted himself between Lila and the car, staring down the driver like he was daring him to move. Mr. Hargrove sighed a long, theatrical sound and tapped his cane again. This is getting tiresome, he muttered. I'll give you one chance to walk away, young man. Jake didn't budge. And I'll give you one chance to get out of here before I make you... He shot back. The driver cracked his knuckles, but Hargrove waved him off. Again, what was his game? Lila's heart raced as the standoff stretched on, every second heavier than the last. Then Hargrove did something nobody expected. He smiled, a real smile this time, not that creepy half smirk, and turned to Lila. You're stronger than they think, he said, his voice low but clear. That's why I wanted you. Before anyone could react, he nodded to the driver, who climbed back into the car without a word. Hargrove tipped his hat, actually tipped it and slid into the back seat. The engine roared, and just like that, the black car peeled out, leaving a cloud of dust and a stunned silence behind. Carl's jaw dropped, the cash limp in his hands. What the, he sputtered, but Jake cut him off with a glare that could have melted steel. Lila's knees wobbled as the adrenaline drained out of her. Mrs. Tanner hobbled over, shotgun still in hand, and pulled her into a bony hug. "You're safe now, sugar," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Jake kicked at the dirt, muttering about teaching Carl a lesson, but Lila barely heard him. "Safe? After all that?" She looked at Carl, who was staring at the ground like a kid caught stealing, and something clicked. He'd lost big time. The money didn't matter anymore. Trailer Park had stood up for her. Tears stung her eyes as she hugged Mrs. Tanner back, feeling the warmth of someone who cared. Whatever Hargrove's twisted plan had been, it was over. And for the first time in forever, Lila felt like she wasn't alone. The dust from Hargrove's car still hung in the air, swirling like a ghost that wouldn't quite leave. Lila stood there wrapped in Mrs. Tanner's thin arms, her cheek pressed against the old woman's faded housecoat that smelled faintly of lavender and mothballs. Her tears came hot and fast, now soaking into the fabric, and she didn't care who saw. "I didn't know what to do," she choked out, her voice small and shaky. Mrs. Tanner shushed her gently, patting her back like she was a little kid again. "You don't gotta know everything, honey," she said, her tone soft but firm. "You just gotta keep breathing. We got you now." Jake paced nearby, his boots kicking up little clouds of dirt, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He kept glancing at Carl, who'd slunk back toward the trailer, the wad of cash still crumpled in his fist. "You're a real piece of work, you know that?" Jake called after him, his voice thick with disgust. Carl didn't turn around, just hunched his shoulders and muttered something nobody could hear. The fight had gone out of him, like a balloon deflating all at once. Lila watched him go, her chest tight with a mix of anger and something sadder. Pity, maybe. He'd always been a mess, but tonight he'd hit a new low. How could he do that to her, sell her like she was nothing? Mrs. Tanner let go of Lila long enough to hobble over to Jake, her little dog trotting at her heels. "Leave him be, Jake," she said, resting a hand on his arm. "He's got his own demons chasing him now." Jake scowled, but nodded, his jaw tight. He looked at Lila, his eyes softening just a bit. "You okay?" he asked, almost gruff, like he wasn't used to being gentle. She wiped her nose on her sleeve and nodded, even though she wasn't sure it was true. "Okay, after all that," but standing there with Mrs. Tanner and Jake, and even that yappy dog, she felt a flicker of something warm, like a tiny candle lighting up a dark room. The trailer park was quiet again, the cicadas picking up their song like nothing had happened. A few neighbors lingered on their porches, whispering to each other, their faces a mix of shock and pride. One of them, Mr. Ruiz from 2 trailers down, called out, "Good on you, Mrs. T," and raised a beer can in salute. She waved back with a tired smile, then turned to Lila. "Come on, sugar," she said, tugging her toward the porch. "You're staying with me tonight. No arguing." Lila didn't argue. Couldn't, really. Her legs felt like jelly as she followed, Jake trailing behind like a protective shadow. Inside Mrs. Tanner's trailer, the air was warm and cluttered with old photos, crochet blankets, and the faint hum of a box fan. She sat Lila down on a sagging couch, handed her a glass of sweet tea, and started fussing over a plate of cookies like it was the most normal thing in the world. "You're one of us, Lila," she said, her voice steady now. "Ain't nobody gonna take you away. Not Carl, not that fancy old creep, nobody." Jake flopped into a chair, stretching his long legs out, and gave her a lopsided grin. "Yeah, we're tougher than we look around here," he said, and for the first time that night, Lila felt a shaky laugh bubble up. She sipped the tea, the sweetness cutting through the bitter taste of fear still lingering in her mouth. Carl was out there somewhere, probably stewing in his trailer, but he didn't matter right now. Hargrove's weird words echoed in her head. "You're stronger than they think," as she wondered what he'd meant. Did it even matter? Maybe not. What mattered was this: the way Mrs. Tanner's hand rested on hers, the way Jake's quiet presence filled the room, the way the trailer park had rallied when she needed it most. She wasn't just some girl to be sold off. She was Lila, and she had people who'd fight for her. That thought settled deep in her chest, heavy and good, like a promise she could hold on to. Sometimes, she realized, The loudest strength comes from the quietest places. And tonight, that strength had saved her.